Welcome to the Grow Down on Soil Health, the podcast where we dig deep into sustainable farming practices that can enhance your land and your bottom line. I'm your host, Dr. Ben West, Executive Director of Farmers for Soil Health, a program dedicated to improving soil health practices such as planting cover crops. Today we'll hear from a teacher turned full-time farmer and discuss their journey into regenerative agriculture, including forming a peer network, growing a cattle operation, starting cover crops, and managing water resources. I'm joined today by farmer, rancher, and 2025 Conservation Ag Operator Fellow, Michael Thompson. Michael, thanks for being here today.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So first of all, I want to know what the 2025 Conservation Ag Operator Fellow Award is. What is that?
It's basically one that they bestowed upon me. National No-Till has bestowed on me. But basically what it was following me throughout the year and seeing some of my, it was supposed to be following my successes with no-till and cover crops. Unfortunately, we happened to do it on the year where I got one of the least rainfalls that I've gotten in a long time. So we kind of transitioned from doing a lot of, I was doing a lot of different biologicals and stuff like that. And unfortunately, we kind of pivoted from that, and kind of it became more of a story of resilience this year than it did of new successes and trying new things. So
you grew up on the farm. A lot of farm kids grow up and they can't wait to leave, and a lot of farm kids, all they ever want to do is stay. You were the latter, but it took you a while, and you took kind of a circuitous route back to the farm. Tell us a little bit about your background. What'd you do as a young person, and how did you make your way back to the farm after a long hiatus?
Well, I guess the first thing that I can remember is like, in kindergarten, we used to have those, what do you want to be when you grow up type of things, where you had to make a picture and, fill out what I want to be when I grow up. And actually, I still have it. My mom and dad have it still down, downstairs, tucked away. It's still hanging on a wall in my childhood bedroom. And, it said, I want to be a farmer and I want to be a teacher. And I guess at 5, I have no idea why I said that I wanted to do the teaching thing, because I grew up on the farm. But, I always wanted to farm. I really just loved the, growing things, seeing things grow, whether it be cattle or crops, just seeing the circle of life. It's just a wonderful, lifestyle. At 18, my, dad didn't really sit down with me. My mom sat down with me, and she said, basically, she goes, dad and I have been talking, and I don't think that dad wanted to have that discussion with me. So he threw mom under the bus and said, you need to go talk to him about this. And so I remember her saying, just, this isn't going to work. You need to be thinking about what you're going to do that's not farming, because just there's probably not enough farmland for 2 incomes, and that is just not going to work. That our farm just probably can't support 2 people or 2 families. And I was like, okay. So I kind of pivoted and went to diesel mechanics school, did that and got an associate's degree nighttime when I was doing my education. Came back and worked for a neighbor for a while, did some farming and some water well drilling with him. Ended up actually back.
Did you work as a diesel mechanic?
I did work as a diesel mechanic for a short time for a few neighbors and stuff. It was my own thing, but I did do it for a while. I determined that, I was going to wear my body out pretty quickly, if I was doing that all day, every day. And dad kind of said that too. He said, it's not bad when you're 20, but he said, when you're 50 or 60, he said, you feel it every day. So he kind of gave me the push to kind of go figure something else out. I returned to my home district, and I actually worked with a little visually impaired boy and learned Braille and really was interested in the whole education game. So I went back when my brother graduated from high school. I went back to college the same time that he did. So I quit my job at the school and got my education degree. And my superintendent kind of said, well, I think we could probably find a job eventually for you, because, you're really, you would fit here, So I actually came back and started teaching at the home school district that I grew up in. So that was rather fulfilling, seeing some of these, things go full term. Some of my classmates and other ones have kids, and I got to teach them. So.
And you taught kindergarten.
I taught kindergarten.
Oh, Michael, there are, first of all, if you look at the data, there are fewer and fewer guys getting into K through 12 education in general, but especially primary grades, especially kindergarten.
Yep.
You had to feel a little bit out of place.
I felt very out of place. I stand almost 6'8", and so there were a lot of times that, but the kids really thought that it was awesome because, I could touch the top of the door. I had to duck through door frames. And they thought it was really cool that they had a male because, primarily, unfortunately, elementary education has shifted to just so many females. So it was kind of cool giving them that, some of them needed that male role model because they just didn't have that in a single parent home. So it was very fulfilling. And then to take it full circle, I guess I'm feeling a little old now because I actually have some students that were my first class that they're grown up and they have returned to the farm and they're asking me about, I've been working with some of my former students about, implementing some of these practices, no-till and rotational grazing and stuff. So it kind of makes me feel like, I'm still kind of the educator deep down. So,
I'm an educator as well. I love to teach. I teach mostly adults in professional development settings. And I've just always marveled at people who taught kindergarten in those younger grades voluntarily because I think I would absolutely go crazy.
Well, they always say that, if you can explain it to a kindergartner, you can explain it to anybody because you've got to be really basic, but you've got to be thorough in their understanding. So, and I've transitioned, in my adult, I still get my educational fix, I guess, through all of what I'm doing. Like being at the National No-Till Conference talking, being on some boards, No-Till on the Plains and Kansas Soil Health Alliance is something we created to kind of farmers and ranchers helping other farmers and ranchers, just trying to do better. So I guess that's been kind of my adult life work as I've transitioned out of that full-time teaching. I still have the teacher bones in my body somewhere deep down because I like helping people. I find it very rewarding in the fact that you can talk to people and say, and you've had people that say, hey, I'm farming totally different, or you made a big difference in my county, or you made a big difference in this state or this region, because you're telling people about, these ways of farming.
So how'd you make it from the kindergarten classroom back to the farm? Tell us that journey.
It basically, there were a lot of long hours when I was teaching. I'd work days. I'd come home and, if there was planting season or something like that, didn't have my days. So I'd be, spraying, planting, doing stuff like that in the evening time or, basically overnight. I'd work a lot of late hours. Dad helped because Dad was full time on the farm still. So, he did a lot of the day to day with the cattle and stuff when I was away. But as far as, when the prime time, when the planting, harvesting type thing went, as soon as I could get away from the school, I was home sitting in a cab, putting the hours in and, just trying to build the farm up, and that's kind of where we got the transition to no-till. When I came back, we did kind of a min-till for a while with Dad. We did very kind of planting into stubbles and stuff, but always when we transitioned back to that wheat, like that cereal, we'd always have tillage to prepare the seed bed because we just didn't have the seeding equipment on the drill side of things to drill the cereal crop into residues. So we'd always work the ground back to then. So, when I transitioned back to the farm in 2000, I bought a little piece of ground, 480 acres and transitioned back to the farm, and I just bought the first sprayer, self-propelled sprayer, and first no-till drill.
So you've been back on the farm since 2000.
Since 2000.
So you've been farming full time for 25 years now.
Yep. So 2000 was the last couple of years that I was in college. I did get a grad degree when I was in college, so I went a little longer than most. But yeah, so since 2000, we've been completely no-till, and I'll give my dad credit. He didn't buck me on that. He just said, it's a transition. It's something we need to do. And, really struggled the first few years when we did no-till because we just had the absence of tillage. So we stopped tilling, but there were still a lot of things. We still didn't have a healthy soil because we'd go through dry times where our crops would not be robust. We just needed more moisture. And it's because we just didn't have our soil right. We still had a lot of old plow pan layers and a lot of restrictive layers. Our roots weren't they were kind of in a flower pot, the top foot and a half of soil. So they were growing in a flower pot. So when we went through 3 weeks or a couple months of drought, our crops would wither and die. Or we still have big rain events. We'd still have ditching we're pretty hilly in our area. So we'd have ditches and we'd have, erosion happening. So Dad was kind of getting to the point, by say about 2005, 2006, we were even starting to have that early in, we were already starting to have weed resistance, chemical resistance issues, those kinds of things. So Dad was kind of, a little bit like, I want to make no-till work, but he said, this is basically not working. We're going to probably have to go back to tillage. And I desperately did not want to go, change. I saw benefits.
You saw the long term.
I saw the long term, and I saw
yeah.
that we were making gains, but it wasn't fast enough. So that's when we started going, that's where I totally went to the drawing board and started learning about, how the soil was made. Our prairie soils were covered most of the year, and they had diverse root systems. And, if you've just got wheat, corn, and, maybe some soybeans or some milo or something, you don't have a real diverse system because that's basically all grass, they're mostly grasses. And so, we needed those tap roots to break up that soil. We needed that fibrous root. We needed a lot more biomass to cover the soil. So that's how we started getting into cover crops. It seemed like a no-brainer because we could take out those fallow periods where we didn't have anything growing. We were trying to bank that moisture. And I totally had to flip that on the head that we needed to use moisture to fix our soil so that we could gain more moisture into the soil profile and store it, because water doesn't store in our soils, at surface. It just, it evaporates. It's just not there. The wind or the sun evaporates it out. So we needed to have a full profile. And the only way to do that was to get a lot more diverse rotations going. And the best way I knew to do that is we had cattle and we had cropland, and to take the fallow piece out and plant a diverse forage mix and then hit it with cattle. And we were able to build our cattle numbers up and run more animals that way too.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, Michael. You're becoming an endangered species. Farmers who have a robust row crop and livestock operation, there's just fewer and fewer of them around the country. Both are so demanding. Mm-hmm. It's really easy to see why farmers would say, hey, I'm really going to focus on row crops or livestock. But you took a completely different approach, and you've got a really diversified farming operation. I think what's really fascinating is you and I were talking about before the show, and I was asking you about your cattle operation. Most farmers I talk to who have a diverse operation like yours talk about the economic benefits. Like mm-hmm. you've got two different revenue streams, and when one market is up, maybe or down, maybe another market will be up, which is actually the case we have right now. Obviously, row crop commodity price is down, but cattle price is pretty good right now. But that's not what you talked about. You talked about the benefit of the livestock on your soil health practices and on your row crop operation. So talk about that. How have you used livestock? How important have they been? How do you manage livestock to improve your soil health?
I think that livestock can be a wonderful tool, and that being said, it has to have that management piece on it. You can't just open a gate and hope to heck that your soil health is going to improve by just throwing some animals out there, because I've seen a lot of detriment to livestock too in our arid environment. If you take too much, you've got to be able to give some grazing days back to the soil. You can't leave them out there that extra 2 weeks. Sometimes you've got to pull them off and move them. But as you've invested in the whole system, you've probably got a pasture somewhere that's regrown that you could put them on, or you've got some more ground somewhere, with crop residues or something else that you can rotate them on and not take too much. But you really got to just approach it like the livestock for us have been a tool. We're getting biology back on the soil through, the rumen, we're getting manure, we're getting urine. So we're getting actually nutrients out of the animals. And quite frankly, just the hoof action of them being out on the soil, knocking some of these residues down. And if you want to look at it, I still have, quote unquote, a little bit of tillage, so to speak, because the cattle actually, stomp it down into the top few inches of the soil or get it in contact with that microbiology in the soil. And so they start the decomposition process. I kind of look at it as we're doing composting on a large scale. This is it's a longer term composting. It's not that jump that you see in 1 year where, like, if you apply a good compost, but it's kind of inoculation for the soil, from the cattle gut. And number two, it's just a good way to get enough residue that we can grow some good crops. Because in our arid environment, we're not blessed with corn and soybean type yields where, in the I states where, we have too much residue. We hardly ever have too much residue from our crops. Once it's left over, we need to keep as much of that crop residue intact as possible. So this is a good way of building that soil and keeping a lot more residue. And that goes into sustainability with less chemical, less times we have to spray because we've got more soil cover. So weeds aren't as much of an issue. Nutrient cycling, with the nutrient cycling from the microbial life and through these cover crops breaking down, our nitrogen goes further. It's a whole systems approach. I don't know how to convey that, but it's kind of a cyclical thing. The cattle help build the soil. We grow better crops. The crops help build better soil because we have more residues. And then we're able to kick the cows out on some of these residues, and get some, but it's got to be time grazing. There just can't be like you leave them out there for 6 months or 8 months because that's just going to do more detriment than good. So,
yeah. And the way you're managing your operation mimics natural processes before humans arrived. When you think about what the Midwest was, it was a lot of diverse plant communities, but large grazers and bison that were coming through, intensely grazing, completely scalping the landscape in a short period of time, a lot of hoof activity like that. Those processes over thousands, millions of years is what built those deep soils where you are, and rich soils. And you try and mimic as much as you can. We were talking about your cattle operation and your management, like the rotational aspect of that. And you talked about that, you've had a lot of success in taking marginal farmland and improving it pretty quickly, the soil health of those tracts.
Yep.
Through your cattle program.
And as we've grown, we've taken on probably what you'd call some of the quote unquote rougher ground, or those diamonds in the rough type of pieces that they were weedy. They were side hills that were poor, had been eroded for years and were poorer ground. But, I'm able to, now knowing what I know, I can kind of approach those. I really still want to take on better ground because it's less, less investment, less work. But, it's something that I'm not scared about taking on a piece that looks a little bit rough because I know we can turn it around and change it. So,
yeah. And tell me how you manage your livestock. We were talking about when you were a younger man, you tried to move the cows every day. That's harder to do now, obviously, because you have so many other demands. But talk about, I think in so many parts of the country where you have part-time livestock producers, they still have not really been introduced and understand the benefits of short duration, high intensity livestock rotation.
Oh yeah. And like I said, I used to do, when I was a young man and I was first married and no kids, it was pretty easy to go out there and build some fence, or, spend one day and you'd build enough for a week, and it would just be dropping some fence along the week. But, as I've got 3 kids under the age of 11 now. So as my demands have, my priorities have changed in the fact that family has to, family still comes first, that they've got a lot of activities that we go to. So, it's been 5 days to a week, but that's still better than nothing. Sometimes it's been when we're busy planning and stuff, where it's just my dad and I. My dad's kind of taking a more of a retirement piece, and my brother helps out when he can, but being a CPA in the spring, he's still finishing up with taxes and stuff. So he's pretty busy. So, as the demands have kind of shifted, we've had to just make shifts in our grazing. But anytime you can get animal impact, short duration animal impact, you control a lot of the compaction issues on your land, that you would have with just, long-term grazing. And probably the other time with short-term grazing is you can keep a lot more of the soil building aspect. You can keep more residue. You get more stuff in contact with the soil. You really spark that soil to life, so to speak. That I think that's where the soil building happens, because it's a decent amount of animals for a short amount of period. You get off it, you give it rest and recovery, and our soils love those rest and recovery and those times of high impact. But then if you give it that time to kind of rest and recover, it's been a wonderful thing. The longer that I'm into this, I see a real benefit that livestock component probably even needs to be maybe a little bit bigger than it is, because almost every year we get enough rain that we can grow forage. But there's some of those really dry years where we're like 2 inches shy of raising that really good corn crop or raising that really good soybean crop or, a lot of times we're just a little bit shy. So, and I guess on the other side of having that crop ground, if we have total failures, where we just have no rainfall, that it's not going to make it to harvest, we're able to go out and still, capitalize on some of that quote unquote, loss, from the crop side. We're able to graze those crop residues. And back in 2022, we were really dry and we had a couple fields that the insurance just deemed not worthy to harvest. It was just going to cost us probably as much to harvest as we had out there. So we actually did strip grazing where we grazed standing corn, and we did that all winter long. Cows came out in really excellent condition. The soil kept a lot more cover because we didn't cut anything loose. There was, they grazed, but they left a lot of stalks. So we got a lot of residue out there. So it was a wonderful opportunity. So that's kind of some of those things that you tease out with livestock that, maybe the regular row crop producer might not be able to do. So,
and I hear the regular row crop producer, I hear regularly from row crop producers concerns about livestock and soil compaction. Mm-hmm. So talk about that a little bit. Is that an issue on your farm? How do you manage it?
I will say that, there are places, say like around the watering point, when you have tanks, that's a high traffic area. Even if you keep it moving, you're going to put some compaction in because that's just a place where they come back for water and it's a high traffic area. So there are some areas, we've most noticed that, like where we put our tanks, like, that would be like in what you call the in row or the turn row of the field.
Which is your lower production. So yes. you're putting those tanks in areas where you're already not.
We're putting them in the places where like the truck would sit and we'd unload. My newest thing that I haven't quite got there yet, but I've really been thinking about is planting like field borders, because where we don't have really, the edge effect, or around the edge, that's where usually, you take grain out, you've put your tanks, you have more compaction. So there are some compaction areas like that. And I think that those probably, a buffer strip of 20, 30 feet around there, like, basically to turn on and to haul grain out on. If that was in perennial system, I think that might be benefit, versus trying to annually crop it, but we're not quite there yet. On a whole though, as far as compaction goes, the actual animal, if you figure out like today's, grain carts, if they're a 1,500 bushel grain cart, you've got a combine that holds 300 to 500 bushels, on there. You're talking a lot of axle load on a lot of row crop things. So a lot of, I think, our machinery puts just about as much compaction as a cow does. And actually, a lot of people think that it's compaction too. If you see dimpling, like if the ground's a little bit wet and they keep a little bit of a dimple out there, they think, oh my gosh, it's going to be rough, whatever. We really haven't witnessed that being any rough. In fact, that's kind of helped us on our side hills. If you get those little dimples, they're kind of like little mini ponds where the water runs in and it kind of holds it a little bit. So, a lot of the things that are deemed as cattle compaction are probably just surface issues mostly. We haven't noticed a yield drag. Like I said, in fact, we've seen things get better when we've actually had cattle out on it versus some of the things that we didn't originally. We just went straight no-till. Because when I first got into no-till in that 2000s, that 90s to 2000s mindset was, oh my gosh, no livestock out on the ground, good no-till. You want to keep your compaction at bay, so you definitely don't want livestock out there. You don't want anything. And we did it as a matter of necessity. We didn't have enough pasture land. We didn't have enough, we needed to do something to pay the bills. So that's how we got into the grazing things. But we've seen so many benefits out of the grazing. I really think that the reward outweighs the risk there, with compaction. I really don't think that we see long-term. And some of it's too, the management piece. If you're keeping more surface residue, honestly, and this is something everybody could try at home, is you put your hand down on the ground, take a whole bunch of grass or surface residue, put it over, and then have somebody step on your hand. You won't feel the weight on that because it's dispersed. It's kind of that snowshoe effect of why you don't break through the snow with a big wide snowshoe. And if you keep more surface residue, those cattle aren't pounding the ground down, and they're not keeping that that compaction in the top. So honestly, if you keep that residue, you keep them up out of the ground, they don't pocket up. The longer that you're in a no-till system, you're building that aggregate stability. So you got a whole bunch of sugars and biotic glues that glue the soil together. So your cattle aren't sinking into the ground. That it's got aggregate stability. So the ground has some density and it holds together so that it's just not like pudding after a rain, that you're not going out and doing it. And there's still times, if we get into like a really rainy period where we have like 10 days. This is very rare in our area that we'd ever have, day after day of rain. But, there are times where we've had a week of pretty moist soils. Usually we have some place where we can either take them back to an adjoining pasture. We can put them in some place that's quote unquote a sacrifice area, that we're not worried about, pocking the ground up, making a big mess. But, I've actually had some happy incidences where they've been out and we've got a huge rain and I think, oh, that looks like a train wreck. They really stomped that up, and incorporating of organic matter has actually come out in the end. It wasn't nearly the train wreck that I thought it would be. That, just seeing it, I was like, oh, that looks pretty bad. So, and I'm not going to say there's not times where you can have that, but again, management. And in wetter times, I just keep them moving. I'd err on the side of less grazing and more movement so that you just don't keep them out there too long to where you're causing damage. So.
Before we keep digging in, let's talk about Farmers for Soil Health. This is a program established by farmers for farmers and focuses on strengthening soil health practices like cover crops to enhance the environment and profitability of farmers. Through this podcast, which is in partnership with the Soy Checkoff, Port Checkoff, and the National Corn Growers Association, we dig deep into sustainable farming practices. We're bringing you tangible, experience-based, and research-backed information that can help you enhance your land and your bottom line. And if you're enjoying this episode so far, check out our other episodes that have been posted already and are coming in the future. So, Michael, we're talking about compaction and techniques to manage compaction and a diverse farming operation like yours. We have row crop and livestock operations. And I know cover crops are a big part of your strategy. Cover crops have, so many benefits once farmers figure them out. And one very specific one is as a tool to help manage compaction and maybe other issues associated with the livestock row crop operation. Talk about your use of cover crops a little bit, how you use them, when you use them, what benefits you see, and maybe what challenges you have with them.
Boy, that's a pretty broad topic, but we'll dive into there. I think the main thing that when you're approaching this is, especially in from my perspective as a more of an arid environment, you've got to use them as a tool, and you just got to start looking, the best tool you can use is a shovel. Go out there, start digging in your soil. And if you don't know what you're looking at, go find somebody from, NRCS, find a neighbor that's doing these things that can help you, see the compaction levels. But, know where your compaction levels are, and then start building cover crops, diverse cover crops. I mean, so many people, want to plant, grasses. If we already got grasses and there's nothing wrong with planting a cover crop that has a grass component in it, but there's a hunger in that soil for broadleafs. If we're all say you're like a corn wheat type of rotation, those are all, warm grasses. Season, cool season grasses, but they're grasses. So where's your component of broadleafs? Well, the component of broadleaf comes in, that's the weeds. That's where you start seeing broadleaf weeds in like a rotation that's grass heavy. So, I have found that you can put the broadleafs in. That helps you with giving that soil that broadleaf component. the wonderful thing, there are a lot of broadleafs that have tap roots or that have like, pretty diverse root systems that we're not going to see in a cereal crop or a grass crop. It's not bad to have the grasses because the grasses provide a lot of biomass and a lot of cover for the surface. And they also have a lot of fibrous root systems that attack that surface type compaction. But you also need to attack that deep down compaction. And that would be through a lot of the tap roots. It's not bad to have some tubers in there, like a radish, turnip type of thing, because those tubers, maybe even sugar beets, some areas, are more sugar beet, prone areas. So, have that tuber, because that tuber is holding on to a lot of your, leftover nitrogen, leftover phosphorus, it's going to cycle those nutrients too. So.
Yeah. And so, and talk about soil compaction, a little bit, since we were talking about that earlier. How are you using cover crops as a tool with that?
So I think a lot of us don't think about it, but, a lot of us are kind of like farming in a flower pot, that our roots are only going down in the top 10 inches, foot and a half of soil. And, if you're digging, something you can look for is in, whether it's cash crops or whether it's cover crops, if your root systems are going totally horizontal, they're coming to an area and they go totally horizontal and then maybe down a little bit, more horizontal, you probably have some compaction layers that those roots can't get through or are trying to find a fissure or a crack to go through. So there's probably some compaction down there. The more that you can open that ground up and farm in the whole profile, and this goes for wet and dry areas too, because in wetter areas, they've got drainage tile, but if your soil isn't open to where the moisture can get down through that soil to the drainage tile to be drained, in a dry area, if your roots can't go down 4 feet into the soil to, really go through that profile, you're not going to make it through those adverse weather conditions, whether it be wet or dry, that you need that good soil structure to do that. And so cover crops, a diverse cover crop can start building that soil and building those aggregates. And, some people would say, well, I can use like a inline ripper, or I could use something like that. I'm not saying that you can't use that, but that's only a temporary tool because it's only going to stay open for 6 to 8 to 10 months from the studies that I've seen. If you don't have that root is actually creating, glue. It's basically sugary glue, biotic glues. And those biotic glues are holding that root, holding those channels open, whether it be, worm channels. Worms have the same thing. If you feel a worm, it's got that sticky outside and it's keeping that soil glued together and open. So, obviously, what percentage of your fields every year are cover cropped, would you say? How much are you using cover crops on your farm? It really depends. Where we're using them, and I'm going to say that we use some, not as necessarily, I still say that they're cover crops because we're using them for supplemental grazing. So we're still leaving cover. But with the supplemental grazing component, I'd say, but at least a third to half at any given time are in covers of some kind. Probably not just a soil building, probably for that extra component of that supplemental grazing. And we kind of do that because it gives us that flex factor of still being able to keep our animal numbers to the point where we need them. If we were a little bit more able to fluctuate cattle numbers, like say we were in an instance where we brought calves in or something that we could literally sell a little bit easier, but where we're cow-calf, when we bring genetics on and we want to keep those cows and those, that cow-calf operation, you want to keep your calf more intact. Having a few extra 100 acres has been our buffer for drought so that we're not overly grazing our pastures or we're not overgrazing our cropland. We have that extra, component for forages. So. Yeah.
So obviously a lot of complexity in your operation. And, one of the things I ask people regularly, in sustainable farming, farmers in particular, I love to ask the question, about cover crops. I know farmers who would tell me cover crops are so important to my operation. If I didn't have that tool, I don't know if I could farm anymore. And I have farmers tell me, I've tried them. I will never try them again. There will never be another cover crop on my farm. And as I've asked the question, what's the difference between these two? A lot of it is just knowledge and education of understanding the nuances and the complexities of how to use this tool on specific fields, specific contexts for specific problems. So there's, as always, the system is complex. Natural systems, farming systems are complex, and farmers, they're going to have to continually learn throughout their career. And I know, you're an educator, and we were talking earlier about how important lifelong learning is to you. Talk a little bit about that. For you yourself as a farmer, how have you continued to evolve and learn new knowledge to make your operation better and better?
Well, the good news is that I feel like in the last 10 years, there has been so much more, through just right here, through podcasts, through videos. There's so many videos, and there's even great field days. There's so many great opportunities locally that you can go to. And I guess I can't really tell you how important I feel it is, because I've seen that time and time again. Guys will get into a program or utilize a government program to get into cover crops, but they never have that education component about learning why they're using them. It's just, we're plugging them in, and nobody comes out to support them to say, oh, look, your roots went down 3 feet and they only used to go down 16 inches. And it's no fault of the producer, because we get busy and we just don't think that way, but the education piece, if you're out there learning, I think it's twofold. Number one, it's giving you the reason why you're doing what you're doing, and you're learning more about why we need to be committed to that practice, whether I'm personally, and nothing against people that are in government programs, I have not taken government money to do this. I have been doing it with out of my own pocket, because I see the benefit of the cost savings. But I think if you have the education, why you're doing it, and you're going to stick with it longer. Number two, just the peer network component. Farmers helping farmers. That's why I say, I'm not against, we're all busy. So if you can get that education in the tractor cab, or, at home, 10:30 at night, make it fit your schedule. But sometimes you need to get away to come to these conferences, to come to a field day, because it's not about the presenter. It's not about the topic. Maybe you know quite a bit about that topic. It's that hall conversation, or I've met best friends now that I've sat next to that, we've shared, so much. We've gone through 4 or 5 years of farming in 1 year, because we've had 5 or 6 guys doing little tweaks on the same thing, and we're seeing what works and what doesn't. So it accelerates our education quite a bit. And I guess from something that we never even touched on, from a emotional standpoint or a support standpoint, when you go through those hard times, you've got a phone call to make, or you've got somebody on, Snapchat or whatever you're on, you Twitter, you've got somebody, it may be an ocean away. I've got people in Australia that farm in my same environment in Australia, that it's cool that we can still, have that conversation and have that support network.
Isn't it amazing, Mike? I mean, you and I are the same era, and during our lifetimes, the information technology has just exploded. And while there's lots of things I hate about social media,
yep.
Man, isn't it interesting that we live in a time now where you can go online with a little box in your pocket and all of a sudden you can be connected to real experts in whatever you do all around the world. I think about some of my hobbies, like, I'm a hobbyist woodworker, and there's some woodworking forums online, and, you go on, and some of the people that post really are novices. They don't know what they're doing, but there are some of the greatest experts in the world that participate in these forums. And now all of a sudden, because of technology, we're connected to them, and we can learn from people who have real knowledge, and they don't have to be your neighbor. Like you said, they could be sitting in Australia or any part of the world.
And that's one of the things too, with this environment that we're in. It's wonderful in the fact that we can talk to experts, and you can reach out to that expert, and you can talk, maybe in real time even, to that person and pick their brain. But, the support that we get from this network, it's twofold. It's both emotional support, but it's also educational support. If you really want to make it work, get out there and find that peer network.
Yeah, through opportunities and resources just like this podcast. And with that, Michael, we really appreciate you joining the podcast today. We've talked about, the value and the role of livestock in row crop operations, and using livestock to mimic natural systems to rebuild soil health faster than probably any other way that you could, and you're modeling that at your farm in Kansas. So really appreciate you joining and sharing your expertise with your fellow farmers all across the country and all across the world for that matter.
Thank you so much.
Well, if you have thought this conversation is valuable to you and your kind of thing, make sure to rate our podcast, follow us on social media, and check out our website, farmersforsoilhealth.com. Stay tuned here for more insights on sustainable farming practices. Until next time.